this to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Another great episode here. If you like these episodes, you should give it 5 stars because, I don't know, it makes me feel good. So I would appreciate it. But this episode is great. It centers on a topic that, obviously, if you listen to this podcast, I like to talk about a lot, which is the environment and how to make it cleaner and the right way to go about it. And as you know, I have long advocated for better innovation as a way to clean up the environment and improve our environment and maintain our environment. To help us with that conversation today, we have Houston's very own Yousif Shamoo. He is the Vice President of Research at Rice University. Yousif, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a really great honor. I like your podcast a lot, and I'm happy to be here.
Oh, great. I appreciate that. Have you given it 5 stars?
I'm going to go back and check. I guess I better get on that.
Yeah. I honestly, I say this all the time. I have no idea what it does for me. Maybe it helps me with ratings. Maybe it doesn't. But it's not like I can monetize it, so it doesn't really matter. But I do appreciate people listening to it. We try to always bring on experts like yourself to actually talk about a given subject, and I hope people learn a lot. So let me talk about your bio real quick. You got your bachelor's from Carnegie Mellon. You have a doctorate in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale. Wow. That's, it's no Harvard, but it's pretty good. I'll let you, I don't have a whole lot of affinity for Harvard. I mean, I did my master's there, but I certainly didn't get a doctorate. So
I was going to say, I thought you went to Harvard a little bit.
Yeah, I did. And I watched Yale beat us in a football game, and, it was, and that's what happened. I don't have a lot of an emotional attachment to it either way. You've served as the Vice Provost for Research at Rice University since, I said Vice President earlier, but clearly I misspoke. It's Vice Provost for Research at Rice University since 2014. You oversee strategic planning for university research, including engagement with the industry through research and technology transfer. You were appointed a Professor of BioSciences in 2012. You first joined Rice in 1998. You served as Rice's director of the Institute of Biosciences and Bioengineering from 2008 to 2014, led the coordination of interdisciplinary research amongst the Rice faculty. And let's see what else. That's basically it. I already read about your Ph.D. from Yale. It's worth noting, of course, that I did not get into Rice University, though I do represent it. Hoping maybe one day for an honorary degree or some kind of thing. That'd be nice. But I was not given the honor of attending Rice, and I'm not resentful in the least. So
I can tell.
it doesn't even cross my mind ever. So we're going to talk about innovation today. I mean, it's there's so many interesting anecdotes that we'll talk about from. One thing that I worked on, actually legislation that we got passed, was the Leading Act, which designates additional grant funding for carbon capture technology in the natural gas space, similar to what we see near Houston here at the Net Power plant, which actually takes natural gas in, creates electricity, recirculates the carbon dioxide through the plant somehow, and uses that to repower the plant, and then has zero net emissions as a result. Powers about 5,000 homes. And so just an example of really having our cake and eating it too, which is, I think, what we'd be looking forward to in a future of clean energy, but also not destroying our economy. What are the most exciting things you guys are working on right now?
I think there's a lot we've got going on in the research space. And one of the best parts about my job is learning about, new research is happening all across campus in different disciplines. I'm a biochemist by training, biophysicist. So it's been fun for me to learn about energy. And I think we've got a lot of really good ideas that are sort of in the same vein of, I think we can really use innovation to solve many, if not all, of the problems associated with, keeping prosperity going, keeping the world developing, and doing it in a clean and safe and sustainable way. I think we've done it over and over again as a species. It's kind of what we do, right? We keep inventing new technologies and moving forward, and I'm very optimistic. So, I feel really strongly that, this is the way to go for us as a country and as a world, really. And so, I'll give you an example. So we have something at Rice called the Carbon Hub, and it was started by a professor here. And the idea is you can take natural gas and you can actually make hydrogen from it,
Hmm.
right? So that doesn't produce any CO2, but what you get out of that process is you make a lot of carbon materials. So you have to find a use for the carbon. You don't want to just throw it into the ground because that takes away, a product stream of something you can make into building materials, or you can make into, aircraft parts or car parts or building materials for construction. And so, there are ways to actually use fossil fuels and do it in a net zero way, just like you've described. And I think, when we think about how to solve the climate problem, I think that's a big part of the answer. So, and, if you'll forgive me, I'll sort of walk through a mental, like an exercise, a little thought process here about why technology is really critical to solving climate problems.
Hmm.
And to do that, basically, we can think about just a thought experiment. To be clear, I'm a techno optimist. I believe that we can invent the technologies and have the innovations to actually be successful in fighting all these fights. So let's imagine that you and I have built a time machine, right? It's going to be, Dan and Yousif's excellent adventure, right? We're going to go back in time and we're going to go back to to 1900, and we're going to sort of decide that we're going to stop the use of carbon emissions. So we want to stop climate change from, getting going, basically. So we go back to 1900, and somehow we convince people that this is a bad idea to burn wood and to burn coal and things like that. And I picked 1900 for a reason, because we're also going to have to get on our horses and go to Spindletop, Texas, to stop the first, big oil discovery in Texas. And we'll have to take horses because, of course, we can't use trains now because we've limited the use of trains. So what
Hmm.
happens? What happens in the world if we were successful? Well, nothing happens. And what I mean by nothing, no electrification, no cars, no airplanes, no internet, no computers, no actual advanced medicine, right? We're sort of stuck. And, we don't have agricultural, we don't have fertilizer for agriculture. The world is stuck in a place where, the population would grow. There would be, essentially more disease, food shortages. It would be a horrific world we would be living in. And so we've, that the idea of just abandoning a whole technology area just doesn't make any sense when you can, look at all the good we've done over the last 100 years.
And it's important to note why. Why would have none of that been created? It might seem obvious to you, but I'm not so sure that everybody is equipped with the tools and arguments to make that case. And so it's important to say, well, why would there be no advanced medicine? What does advanced medicine have to do with oil? And people need to understand that it's from petrochemicals that come plastics. It's also, you need to power industry that creates things like advanced computing. I mean, the mining necessary to get these rare earth minerals and then to build them in a factory. All of these things require power and steel and industry, and none of that occurs without that initial discovery.
Yeah, steel remains one of the most energy intensive industries, and like you said, we need to make plastics. We need to make materials that actually underlie everything we do. The reason our phones work, our batteries work, essentially everything, even the fabrics we wear, are all materials that came out of discovery and innovation. So, I think, yeah, I agree that we don't think about it very much. We don't think about all the technology around us, but we've been very fortunate to be born in this time when we didn't have to worry so much, at least in this country, about basic healthcare and things like that. We have a very advanced society, and a large of that we could have that because of all the energy we have used in the last century to build those technologies.
Right, and on the Carbon Hub, so what are some interesting things that we would be able to utilize carbon for? I mean, we think of carbon dioxide as this pollutant. I don't think that's the right word for it. I mean, does it contribute to global warming? I think we can assume that it does. Yes, I think the evidence suggests that it does. We also breathe it out every time we breathe. So, I don't think it's fair to call it a pollutant. In any case, the idea of a carbon hub is to research uses for it and look at it more as a commodity. So what do you think is that we're on the verge of doing with that?
So I think you're right. It's really a commodity. Carbon dioxide itself is just a gas. It's not good or evil, right? And so, if you think about how to use carbon in the form of not CO2, but rather just carbon like charcoal, right? It's
Hmm.
carbon basically. You can use it for soil remediation. You can use it in building materials. I think we're familiar with parts for cars that are made from carbon fiber materials, right? So bicycle parts, things like that. Carbon fibers are really powerful because they're strong and they're very light. So they have a lot of applications. And so there's a lot of ways in which you can use carbon in productive ways as a commodity rather than a waste product. So in fact, when you burn, natural gas, you make CO2, you're kind of throwing some carbon into the air that you could potentially use for something as opposed to just throwing it into the atmosphere. But to be sure, it takes commercial development. So the Carbon Hub has partners, and the idea is you have partners that are involved in the production of fossil fuels, like Shell, for instance, and you have companies that are part of it that are going to potentially use this carbon. What are we going to use it? How are we going to weave it? Because carbon is different than steel, right? You don't use it in
Hmm.
the same ways. It's more like a fabric almost. If you think about it, you weave it, you make materials from that rather than stamping it out like a car part. So there's a lot to be done just to commoditize this properly. That's important to success.
It, I mean, how far away are we from? I mean, because carbon dioxide, you're essentially talking about sucking it out of the air and then creating material out of it. It's a bit hard to visualize how that happens, and at what point do you think that would ever be feasible?
Well, this particular process takes the natural gas, and as you actually convert it directly to the hydrogen and to the carbon material. So you don't release it as CO2. You actually convert it directly to a carbon black type material, carbon material. So you don't have to recover it out of the atmosphere, which is a big advantage of this particular technology. So because I think it would be hard to imagine sort of pulling pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. Actually, trees do that really well. And that's a good
Hmm.
reason to do reforestation and keep reclaiming land as we get more efficient in agriculture and things like that. Because trees are quite good at this.
That's interesting. And so I want to talk about the $100 million award for advanced materials from the Texas-based Welch Foundation to found the Welch Institute for Advanced Materials. And I think Rice also got a big investment from Army Futures Command in diamond materials. So what are we doing with these advanced materials? Again, what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, it's a very exciting time. Rice has been a real leader in advanced materials since the discovery of the buckyball and the Nobel Prize to Smalley and Curl in the 1990s. And so the advanced materials represents a lot of the things we've already been talking about. So, when you think about quantum computers, people talk about this next generation of computers. They're going to have the ability to do calculations much, much faster than the current computers we have today. Those computers, are still very much in the early stages of development, but they're going to revolutionize how we do weather prediction, cybersecurity, things like that. And of course, at the heart of any computer are materials. So
Hmm.
Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley because of silicon, right? Because essentially people stamped transistors onto these wafers of silicon that essentially underlie all the chips in our phones and all the computers that you and I are now using to record this podcast. And so, the Army's investment with us is in a new type of replacing silicon essentially with a diamond thin film. So it turns out diamond, which is a carbon material, has really cool properties in terms of being able to generate high frequency RF radio frequencies. It dissipates heat really well. There's a lot of reason it could be essentially the next generation of types of chips that would be made for lots of different applications. And so that would produce better networks, better phones. We've got 5G now. Who knows? My kids will have 10G, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that'll happen that'll make things more efficient and more energy efficient as well. So we'll get more calculating power and we'll be more energy efficient, which is sort of coming back to our theme, which is you can keep imagining a world where we just keep getting better at doing things with the technology and becoming even more efficient with the energy.
Yeah, and you don't even have to imagine it. I mean, economists would point out that the more developed a nation comes, the cleaner it becomes. That seems to be true across the world and throughout history. So it stands to reason that the push for innovation as a solution to both climate challenges and the environment seems to be the right one. It's not just theory; it's true in practice, I would think. One other thing you guys focus on is, so we talk about reducing emissions. I give net power as an interesting example of that. But also reversing the impacts of climate change. Do you have an overview of what Rice is working on in that space as well?
Well, I think that's a long arc problem, right? Because there's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere already, and so I think if you think about the 25, so companies like BP have already come out and said they're going to really actively manage their energy transition to be an energy company. And I think Houston is well positioned to be a leader in the energy transition. So I think, we are the energy capital of the world. And I think that Rice and Houston can be a leader in developing those technologies and trying to essentially bring the next generation of sustainable energy as well as the transition, right? Because countries need to develop, as you point out, right? As countries develop, they get cleaner, they get safer, they get essentially more productivity. So countries that are developing still, as they develop, will become cleaner, will become essentially more able to contribute to the world. And so you don't want to just sort of cut those countries off or cut them off at the knees while they're trying to develop. They need to develop. We need them to develop, right,
Mm-hmm.
to solve many of the world's problems like population. As countries develop, they have, because your kids actually have a chance of making it to adulthood. You don't need them to maintain your farm anymore. You don't need 10 kids anymore. So there's ways in which, as you develop, essentially it's this virtuous cycle. Everything gets better, right? Not just for that country, but for the world. And so I think this idea of innovation is an important one. And Houston can be a center for advanced materials and energy discovery, not just not just in fossil fuels, but I think in all types of energy. And I think that's what many of our companies are thinking about now, is how to be, a player 50 years from now, because they want to be here, they want to be relevant, right? 25 and 50 years from now. So I think that's important.
Yeah, it is, and it really goes along this line of reasoning, and I think that continues to be true. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to answer or how to ask this question. Maybe I'll just ask you to define some of these terms. But there's been an interesting story at Rice in discovering a new way to eliminate what was thought to be these forever chemicals, right? So people get really upset when they think about plastics and chemicals that basically never go away. And they never decompose. And this chemical of Gen X and PFOA, and there was using a molecule that's actually so ubiquitous that it's commonly found in eyeshadow. So how did Rice students discover this innovation? Can you tell us about that? Give us some background, because I don't think the way I described it makes sense to anybody listening.
That's all right. Yeah, this is work that came out of Mike Wong's lab here at Rice. He's a professor in chemical and biomolecular engineering. So a chemical engineer would have been the classic. That's what that department would always be called when I was in college. And so, yeah, there's a lot of chemical compounds that are hard to break down. They don't break down naturally. Plastics are a good example that we're all familiar with. And his students, were actually working on strategies to try to break down these long-lived products, because they are in Teflon. They're in a lot of different parts of our economy. And so the idea was, well, if we can't replace them with new materials, and how can we remediate them from water? They get into water, they get into all sorts of things, and they can be and they can be carcinogenic. And so the idea is, how can we reduce or get rid of these compounds? And to be honest, and they at least they were very forthright in discussing it. It was a bit of an accident, like so many things in science. Luck favors the prepared mind. The students were actually thinking this was going to be what they call a control experiment. This was going to be the thing that showed what would happen if nothing happened.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this was like, okay, we'll set this up and this will be nothing happens. Then we'll try the thing we want to try, and that'll be the thing that does something. Right. That's the experiment. Right. And then what they found was, when they mixed a relatively common chemical called boron nitride, and they shine UV light on it, which is a type of ultraviolet light that the sun produces. It produces, if you have a lot of it, can cause skin cancer, but it's also what tans us, why we get darker when we're outside. And they found that that combination of this UV light and this compound was able to break down these really difficult to process chemicals that you've mentioned, polyfluoroalkyl substances, right? And so that's an exact version of this idea that we can, if we know what we're trying to fix, we can usually find discoveries or innovations that allow us to, in this case, break down something which people have thought had been very hard to break down. Now, Does that mean that it's always easy? No. I mean, it takes time, and it takes a lot of really smart students and some really smart people to get together and work on the problem. So that was an example that was almost by accident. They admitted it. So now they're working on how to implement it. And so at Rice, we have the National Science Foundation has centers for specific types of technologies. And so, Rice is fortunate to be the host of one of those sites called Newt, and it has to do with water purification, right? So it's all about purifying and remediating water. And Newt, I'll have to tell you what it stands for, but it's Nanosystems Engineered Research Center for Nanotechnology-Enabled Water Treatment. So we'll just go with Newt, right?
Okay.
It's a lot easier, right? So there are companies that are part of Newt. So the NSF brought together Rice, Yale, UTEP, and Arizona State to build this center. And there are industry partners in water filtration and water processing that are looking at how to use these technologies. How do we bring them to the market, right? Because it's one thing to discover it in a lab, right? It's another thing to get it out into commercial applications where it can do some real good, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea here is that the government has catalyzed a partnership between universities and, in this case, industry. And I think that's a really good model because you need to get the technologies off the campus and into society.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It was something I was going to get to a little later, which is, asking you to describe the government's role in all of this. I think a lot of people, and I definitely have this conversation all the time when it comes to pharmaceuticals, a lot of people believe that it's the government that it's government funding, government research that creates a given technology. And that's why we have it. And that's why it should all be free. And that's why anybody who profits off of it is basically stole it. And I have to explain, especially in the case of pharmaceuticals, that's just not what happens. The basic science is funded, and it's usually at a university or an affiliate of some sort. But to actually bring that to market and commercialize it takes billions of extra dollars, and that's not coming from the government, right? That comes from private investment, and that partnership is extremely important. Is that similar to what you guys do at Rice?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So as you know, in biomedicine, really, if you think of it, if it takes $1 to bring something to the patient's bedside, really only pennies were spent on the initial discovery. Typically, it's the bringing it to make it safe, to produce it in large amounts that requires the pharmaceutical industry to do that development. No university is going to develop 300 million doses of a vaccine or produce a new antiviral or antibiotic at scale. That's not what they do. And in fact, I don't think you'd ever want them to. And nor do I think the government should be doing that, because that investment would have to be huge. If you look at the budgets of those big pharmaceutical companies, that, like you said, it takes a lot of money to bring a product forward. And so, even if the U.S. government said we're going to take all of our R&D money and put it into pharmaceuticals, it would be kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the investment worldwide in developing these new drugs and new molecules. And so, the role of the government is, I sort of see it as seeding ideas out there, allowing a lot of flowers to grow, right? So the idea is the government spends money on basic research and, I would say, early stage research to get it going, and then should not be in the business of picking who's a winner and who's a loser. Let's put it that way. I think if anybody could do that, they would be billionaires anyway. So if any of us can do that, good luck. I mean, you don't even need to be, nobody can do that, right? So the idea is the market can do that, though, right?
You're right. And what I tell people too, because that argument doesn't always work with people who are a little bit more idealistic. They say, well, if it's good for society, then government should just pick that winner. And what I have to tell them is, you don't know if it's good for society yet, right? You're asking a government bureaucrat to make a value-based decision here. And because they're in government, because it is the government, they're susceptible to lobbying. And you are picking winners and losers without really knowing the outcome. And it is not this utopian reality that you wish it to be. The government bureaucrats are not perfect people with omniscient knowledge. It just doesn't work that way. They're susceptible to influence right and left. And you can imagine a government bureaucrat have letters written to them from the various Congress people in various districts, depending on where that winner and loser is located. I mean, there is no actual I think objective value being considered in a case like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I can give you another really good example where I think nobody could have predicted this success, and this is really true. This is a story that repeats itself all the time through history. So, I think all of us are really familiar with the Human Genome Project. So, essentially, around the year 2000, we were able to sequence the DNA of a human being, and that has revolutionized personalized medicine. It's revolutionized our understanding of cancer because now we can understand how tumors have changed over time. That discovery of that technology of how to sequence the human genome was really, really transformative in all of medical and biomedicine, and it will continue to be for generations to come. That technology that allowed people to sequence the human genome actually has its roots in the early 1980s with people that were studying this. You're not going to believe this. People studying these bacteria that actually live and grow in Yellowstone hot springs.
Mm-hmm.
So, those of us who've been to Yellowstone, you sort of see, the geysers there and these really ridiculous pools of water that are boiling, and they're actually acid too, right? So you can't imagine anything could live in that water, but things do. Bacteria do, and people were like, "Well, how the heck can that work? Right? How can a bacteria live in something that should dissolve it?"
Yeah.
And they studied these bacteria, and from those bacteria, they actually isolated the molecules that allowed them to work at those high temperatures and those ridiculous conditions. And then that's the fundamental technology, what's called DNA amplification. That is the ability to essentially make more DNA from a small sample. And that's what allowed the Human Genome Project to work. It's also the reason why if you watch one of these crime dramas like, CSI Miami or something like that, they can take a little speck of blood and then they can get the DNA out of that little tiny speck of blood or the spit on the sidewalk and then, match it to the suspect or something like that. Nobody would have predicted in the early 1980s that those studies would have produced the polymerase chain reaction, which would have gotten a Nobel Prize a few years later, and then that would be the technology that would underlie the Human Genome Project. I mean, who could have predicted that? It's impossible.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that story of how that works. And again, along the same lines of, again, what is government's role? There's a study that I should mention that came out it was published from the OECD, and it's a study about federal R&D, and they found that economic growth was linked not to public R&D but private R&D. It's not that public R&D can't do good. Of course it can. But there's almost no actual economic growth associated with it, and there is a crowding out of private R&D that occurs when the public R&D takes its place, and then there's less economic growth involved in that. It's difficult to get people to understand that trade-off, I think. And I mean, would you agree with the results of that study? Is that sort of what you see? And I mean, and what's the right balance from the public policy perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I agree with it entirely, that's for sure. I think there's a part of the equation that gets missed there. And with the public makes an investment into, say, and I'll use my own laboratory as an example. I'm an infectious diseases researcher, and I have, support from the National Institutes of Health and Department of Defense to do work on emerging pathogens. And so I have, I produce something that makes economic benefit initially? Well, no, it's like the previous story. We do a lot of discovery work that we think informs how the pharmaceutical industry might think about new drug discovery and new drug development. But I also train people, right? So the people who work in pharmaceutical companies, they have to be trained somewhere. So my students, undergraduate and graduate students, come and work in the lab. They learn how science works. They learn how to do good experiments. And then they go off and get jobs. Presumably, a lot of them go off to be doctors. A lot of them go off to be research scientists in big companies. And so, you have to calculate that too, right? That's part of what I do is I train people. I do research. Not only do I do research, but I train people, right? And that is an economic good that I'm not sure, is properly evaluated. I'd have to read the study carefully, of course. But I think that we do a lot. The public money does a lot of good.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly at what step in the process they're talking about R&D. It might be referring to R&D and the actual commercialization of a new drug. I mean, who knows? But it would seem to me that maybe we actually agree with it, given our own experiences there. But we have to look more specifically at it. You mentioned antibiotics a couple times, and I know that this is a focus of yours, an antibiotic resistance, and how bacteria becomes less susceptible to antibiotics. And so, what kind of research are you doing at Rice to solve this problem, and how does this affect our current situation with COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, it's a boom business in infectious diseases right now. It's a very unfortunate situation. But even before COVID-19, these sort of multi-drug resistant bacteria, which really inhabit hospitals mostly, have been a problem for a long time. And it's continued to get worse. And I think for the public's point of view, antibiotics are one of the most important discoveries ever made in our history in terms of health.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most important thing we ever got right as a species is clean water. That's job one. You have to have clean water. And after that, antibiotics have saved a great many lives, probably the single most lives. So if you think about it, like in the Civil War, more people died to disease and infection than actually died from combat wounds, right? So disease has been a bigger bane on our existence than almost anything. And antibiotics, when Fleming discovered penicillin, and then there's sort of the golden age of antibiotics that called all the way through the 60s. At one point, people were writing articles saying infectious diseases are done. We don't have to worry about them anymore. But, what happened was, as we used antibiotics, the bacteria, you actually you select for organisms that actually can become resistant. That is, the antibiotics don't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And so when that happens, you go to the hospital and you get an infection, and now suddenly the doctor uses the first antibiotic and it doesn't work, and then they have to use the second one, right? And then eventually the bacteria become resistant to that one, and they try the third one. And so at some point you can get to the point where essentially the infection is not controllable, and that actually kills a lot of people per year, even young healthy people, because these infections can grow really quickly. So a lot of what my lab does is try to understand how they're becoming resistant. What tricks are they playing to fool the drug, or how are they evading the therapy, the antibiotic? So we spent a lot of time studying, in particular, from the Texas Medical Center. Unfortunately, we've got lots of good test subjects in terms of bacteria that we get from the medical center. We have a lot of good collaborations over there to identify how these bacteria become resistant. And the funny thing is, so most people don't realize where most antibiotics come from. You've heard of penicillin, maybe. Penicillin came from a mold, right? But the most antibiotics actually came from a very humble soil bacterium called Streptomyces, believe it or not. Nobody's heard of it. It's made like 2/3 of all the antibiotics you and I have ever heard of or discovered in human history. So it's a soil bacterium that lives. You could go outside right now, pick up some dirt, and find lots of them. And they make different antibiotics because they make antibiotics to kill their competition, right? So they make this molecule and they sort of put it out in the soil around them to kill their competition, right? And then, of course, their competition fights back, says, oh, no, I'm going to become resistant to that, and I'm going to make my own molecule and kill you. Right? So it's all like a big, arms race. And so what happens is we come along, we say, oh, this is great. This is a great molecule, tetracycline or vancomycin or something like that. Then we make it at industrial scale, start using it in hospitals. And of course, the bacteria, yeah, we've seen this before. We know how to deal with this, right? So they become resistant really rapidly because it's, they've been fighting the soil battle for like 1 billion years. So they're used to seeing these drugs and these molecules. And so it's inevitable when you use them that there'll be resistance. So the idea is, how do you make new molecules, new drugs that would actually evade the strategies they have already, and then get you to the point where you can have sustainable antibiotic development. But it's an ongoing battle. It's not going to be easily solved.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, glad we have people who are smart enough to look to solve it, because most of that went over my head, but it is really fascinating. I do want to switch to food production. This one piqued my interest quite a bit when we're looking at the research that Rice is doing, and I want to talk about a little bit of background here. And again, it just gets to this broader point that it is, I think, improper thinking to believe that we should just stop doing some of the underlying industries, whether it's energy or whether it's food production, just because we observe some kind of environmental impact. Because well, we can look at the history of this. Between 1970 and 2010, we tripled our production of corn, added 80 million people to our population, yet our water usage has remained flat. There's other interesting statistics as well in industry. So technology is always pursuing efficiency. Industry is always pursuing efficiency. And we've seen that the economy was using 40% less copper, 32% less aluminum, 15% less steel compared to the peaks in 1990. Of course, it's not as if we stopped developing. And so this is the same with farming. We've transitioned to more precision farming methods. We use less and less land, less water. So, I mean, what is some of the technology that has contributed to that, and what is rice doing in its research to produce more food using less resources, protecting our environment all at the same time?
Yeah, I think that, clearly, actually, agriculture is one of the great success stories. Not just of America, but of the world, right? I think when I was a kid, I used to read all these very dire predictions that we would run out of food, overpopulation would overrun the planet, and it would be essentially this sort of post-apocalypse kind of scenario. And of course, with each generation, we find better ways to be more efficient in farming and in agriculture in general. Like you said, water utilization has gotten more efficient. Precision farming has allowed people to, get more from every acre of land than they've ever gotten before, and feed the world. I mean, that's an important thing to have gotten right. Feeding the world, and
Yeah.
American farmers contribute dramatically to that, right? So, that seems like a win to me. So, at Rice, one of the things we're interested in, sort of, if you think about the future, is, we're very interested in a field called synthetic biology. So, biology is a field that started, largely by observation, Darwin out observing turtles in the Galapagos Islands and things like that. But it's moving more towards, what I would call a harder science, like you think about physics or chemistry. That is the ability to, you understand how biology works at its real basic principles. So, plants, oftentimes will work with bacteria to fix nitrogen from the air, right? That's a very common um, uh, strategy that plants use. And there are ways to make that more efficient, for instance, because then you wouldn't have to use as much fertilizer potentially, right? So if you understand it's not just the plant, but there's a world that it lives in, this complex soil ecosystem that it's part of, and I wouldn't say we've ignored it. It's just we didn't have the tools to actually investigate it very clearly. Just like we haven't, understood how our own microbiome in our gut has contributed to our health. So as we discover new technologies, we can look deeply into how do plants interact with their environment. Like how do we supplement the soil with biochar, for instance, which is again a carbon product, right? So the idea that when you burn like charcoal, you make ash, and you can use things like biochar to sort of supplement soils. And if you do that right, you can actually do better water retention. You can do all sorts of things just in that exact idea of making efficiency better every generation. And there's reason to think that, I mean, I don't see any reason to be pessimistic about it. We keep coming up with better crops, better essentially management strategies. And I think that, I think it's a very promising area. I don't think that there's any reason to be worried that, our farmers won't continue to be better and better with each generation.
Yeah. Do you think there's a bit of a misguided animosity towards GMOs, pesticides, things like that, or is the balance out of whack? I mean, what's the truth behind some of these debates?
Yeah, I mean, GMOs have always sort of puzzled me because, we have been breeding plants and animals forever, basically. And so, when a farmer finds a new variety of a tomato and he's crossed this plant with that plant, that's a type of genetic engineering when you think about it. And so, there's ways in which if you think of wheat now, it doesn't look anything like what it looked like in the Fertile Crescent, 3,000 years ago. That plant doesn't, and in any way, like, or even a strawberry doesn't look anything like a strawberry, a wild strawberry that people found, hundreds or thousands of years ago. So the idea that that we're like genetically modifying plants is not an evil thing. We modify things, we breed things all the time. And so to me, the idea that GMOs are somehow inherently more dangerous doesn't make any sense to me. Nature experiments all the time, right, with combinations of
Mhm.
of ways of building plants and trees, and we've taken the plants we like and we've made them better. We like big strawberries, not tiny strawberries. We like to have good yields of wheat, right? We like sweet corn. We don't like, I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to ever taste the kind of, like what you'd use for animal feed. It doesn't really taste all that good. We
No,
want sweet corn, right?
right.
That's not how it came up out of the, 2,000 years ago. So I don't really understand why GMOs are seen as this perplexing. And in fact, it's the future, to be honest with you, because we'll be able to
Yeah.
produce plants that do better job in dry climates. We'll be able to produce plants that do better, maybe have more nutritional value, all sorts of things.
I would argue too, we have a moral imperative to pursue these ends because it's America that innovates, and it's the rest of the world that benefits from that innovation. Whether it's cleaner energy, but I say cleaner, but also reliable, which is an important point when we sort of discuss the trade-offs between cleaner fossil fuels or cleaning up our fossil fuel use, but the trade-offs between that and say wind and solar, because there are trade-offs. There's significant trade-offs, and we talk about developing nations, and I think we have a moral imperative to allow these developing nations to rise out of poverty. They can't do so with unreliable forms of energy that can't power industry. They simply can't. The physics just don't work. And it's not just that. It's farming as well. I mean, again, people avoiding starvation, rising out of poverty requires crops that actually work, that are less susceptible to drought or famine or insects or whatever it is. I mean, this is sort of the point of genetically modified plants. And it is strange that it's gotten such a bad name, and it almost, I don't know where those arguments come from necessarily. They feel a little bit dogmatic sometimes. But
Yeah,
but
I agree. It's hard. I mean, for me, and of course, I represent my own views. I'm not representing the university's views here. GMOs have done, can do a lot of good, and especially as the climate change, you want heat resistant and you want, insect resistant crops. But your point about, West Texas has got a great deal of wind energy, which is great for the Texas economy. Solar is a very good energy source. But, there's going to be a lot of ways to approach this energy problem. And, we need to have better transmission lines. We need to have better storage of energy, because when the wind doesn't blow, you've got a problem, because you need to still have energy, because you need, like you said, you need to turn the switch on and it works. And there's other technologies which, I grew up in Connecticut actually, and Connecticut had 50% of its power, and still to this day has 50% of its power from nuclear, for instance.
mm-hmm.
So there's lots of technologies.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about nuclear a lot on this podcast. It would seem to me that nuclear makes a lot more sense for a variety of reasons. If we're going to be investing in something, modularized nuclear seems to me to be the better investment. Again, when you're talking about trade-offs, you're talking about costs and benefits and reliability of energy. I happen to be a big fan of nuclear. Just it seems to work better. But along these same lines, we've talked about, again, improving our energy resources, but also storing carbon. And I probably should have brought this up when we were talking about carbon utilization and what to do with it or how to store it. But you guys are also researching something really interesting, which I won't really try to explain because I'll just sound dumb trying to do it. But basically a bacteria in the ocean that stores carbon in kind of a fascinating way. Do you want to explain that? There's a discovery at Rice that basically says it can be zombified by bacteriophages or viruses that infect bacteria. Okay, so I have no idea what any of that means. Maybe you could explain it, but it's rather interesting.
Yeah, I think it's, most people don't realize like half of the oxygen produced on this planet is actually produced by, not by trees, actually by bacteria or microbes, algae, things that live in, the ocean and the soils. And so it's actually, they're a pretty big contributor to our CO2 oxygen cycle. And so, you can't ignore them. And the question might be, are there ways to actually sort of use that resource, that sink, the ability to take CO2 and produce oxygen in a productive way. And so that's the idea behind this work, is to say, there are these bacteria called cyanobacteria. They're very important. They were actually one of the very first things, they were actually the first organisms that actually helped produce oxygen on this planet. So they've been around a long time and they're still here. And so the idea is, can you actually use these organisms in a way that, to produce more oxygen and take up CO2 and produce what they do with the CO2? Of course, they make it into what trees do. They make it into stuff, right? Trees make it into bark and make it into leaves. And so that's a very positive thing. It's not floating around in the atmosphere. It's not causing global warming. So, all of these solutions are going to be, whether they're technologies that are in biology, or whether they're going to be things like wind, solar, and nuclear, or carbon sequestration, these are all going to be answers, because it's not going to be one thing, right? There's not going to be one answer that produces, that solves the problems, right? There's going to be lots of different answers, and some of them are going to work better than others, and some of them will be, more scalable than others. So, the idea is to make use of this carbon capturing bacteria to take the CO2 out of the air, which is the problem we were talking about a little bit earlier. That's kind of a hard thing to do, right?
Yeah.
To do that in an energy efficient way. How do you pull CO2 out of the atmosphere that's already there? But these bacteria do it anyway. That's what they do, right? So
And
you can use that.
yeah, and is it easy to reproduce these bacteria? I mean, what could we expect? Is there a breakthrough on the horizon? What would we expect in mass scale?
Well, I think the oceans are full of them, right? So they're
Uh-huh.
they're huge, right? And so the question might be, could you farm them basically? Could you have conditions where you encourage them to grow, or could you have ways in which they would produce more oxygen more efficiently? But basically, they're already super abundant, and so it's an idea more than it's, I'd say, a reality at this point. But I think it
Yeah,
reflects the way in which something that right now seems sort of like science fiction. 20 years from now might be producing something which is that people are saying, oh, that was a good idea, right? And
right.
so, you could imagine, I think trees are a good example. Reforestation, pasturage are all ways you can actually sequester carbon dioxide right out of the atmosphere. So we've got solutions all around us. Plants are great at it, right? And, farming and pasturage of animals, and, you can do that very efficiently to do more carbon capture. So again, it's part of a bigger solution, a big basket of solutions.
So we haven't, even though this is part of your background and expertise, we haven't actually talked about COVID-19 very much throughout this podcast. How optimistic are you on the vaccine production, and or are there any other general thoughts about how Americans should be thinking about the disease?
Well, I'm very optimistic about the vaccines. I think the world has quite a large number of vaccines under development at this point, not just in the United States. We tend to hear the ones about that are happening here in the United States, but there's vaccines being developed in Europe, at Oxford, for instance, and all over the world. And that's another case of technology and innovation, right? In the past, it's taken 5 to 10, even more years to develop a vaccine. But with the case of COVID-19, basically what was said to the scientific community and the pharmaceutical industry is, we need a vaccine and we need it as soon as you can make it, right? And within a year, honestly, right, we're not even at the 1 year point yet. It's really, in the United States, we didn't really experience the outbreak until the beginning of the year. We'll have a vaccine. Now, won't be developed in enough doses yet for everybody. That's going to happen over time. But I think it's a pretty amazing accomplishment to say, basically, we want a vaccine against this virus, and we need it immediately. And in that sense, that's a pretty remarkable discovery. So again, I think when given the chance, the scientific, and in this case the pharmaceutical industry, has come through. I think will come through for us. I think that COVID-19 is here for a while. I think we were caught flat-footed by it. And I think, for me as a person in infectious diseases, I don't kind of understand why, because, those people in my field have been saying for a long time, pandemics are a problem, and they're going to be a problem because as human beings expand into the world and into places where animals live, there's more interaction between people and animals, and that's how diseases start. It jumps from an animal to another animal to a bat to a human, and so I think though we're rapidly recovering. At Rice, we have about half of our students here on campus. We've got a pretty aggressive testing program, and I think we've been really good about educating our students about good behavior. And maybe to some people's surprise, our students seem to be really good at sort of understanding what we're trying to get accomplished. So, but maybe that won't surprise you, because I think if you've been in the military, you realize you can train young people to understand operational discipline and be intelligent and hardworking and not do dumb things. But there is a way forward through all this, and we're going to have to do it over the next several months. There's no way to avoid that need to sort of get on with that. We need to sustain some development in our country. We can't all just sit home, for the next year. So there's smart ways to do it, and I think Rice has managed to navigate those waters pretty well. But it doesn't mean that we
Yeah.
won't have an outbreak. I mean,
No, of course not. I mean, if you listen to my podcast, you certainly know where I stand on this. I mean, I believe very much in simply informing the American people, and people will engage in risk and probabilities of risk accordingly. And I think we've made enormous. I think we've implemented enormous costs on society with limited benefit. And at heart, we really do have to trust the people that we seek to govern. And it sounds like that's the approach at Rice. It's an education. You have to educate people on the risks and provide guidelines, and let that play out. But you mentioned caught flat-footed, and this is an interesting discussion for policymakers, because it seems like it's easy to, well, maybe not even easy, but it's at least you can wrap your head around the notion of being prepared for the last crisis that we faced, the last pandemic. But then there's always the future pandemics, and what is it that we should do better to prepare for those, given that we don't know exactly how the next one would look?
Yeah, I think it's always a difficult problem in terms of policy making, right? Because you said we're always ready to fight the last war, right? So, and when Rice was developing its strategy over the summer, we looked really hard at countries that had seen SARS originally a few years ago, the original SARS, like South Korea, for instance. And, we implemented a lot of their strategies on our campus. And that is all very familiar to us now. Things like, social distancing, wearing masks, testing, contact tracing, all those things, because those countries in Taiwan, for instance, had seen them before, and so they knew how to respond, right? So we just sort of took a page from their playbook, right, when we stood Rice back up, and so I think that again, this is an area that is near and dear to my heart. What I would advocate for is essentially to have, we can scan the horizon, right? A lot of it is about, preemption and understanding what could come next. And so that's a lot of what, people in infectious diseases and epidemiology do. They try to understand where the threats are coming from, whether it's Ebola coming from Africa or whether it's flu, which comes every year from Asia. There are some very bright people that can help us be ready for the next. You can't be sure, right? Because it could be a SARS-like virus. It could be something like Ebola or encephalitis, which of course came up into Texas over the last few decades. And so you just have to keep scanning the horizon, right? You have to be vigilant, right? So you've got to have monitoring stations around the world. You've got to be really engaged, because otherwise these things come fast, as we've seen.
Yeah, but I mean, I thought we did, and it's in a place like China, they're not exactly transparent with what's going on. So we could have all the monitoring in the world, and it wouldn't matter, in this case.
Yeah, it's hard because if you don't have transparency, right? And to be clear, nobody wants to be the host of a plague, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's no government, and you can sort of even imagine the city government doesn't want to be known as the place where
Right.
this thing started. And so there's a sort of natural human desire to sort of not be transparent about it. We even see it when people get sick here in the United States. Say,
Mm-hmm.
people, if they get COVID-19, they sort of don't want to say I had COVID-19. It's like you don't want to be the scare people or be the bringer of bad news. But that's something that China is going to have to get over, to be honest with you, right? I mean, that's just something that's just not acceptable for a modern nation, right? This idea. I mean, I might expect it of North Korea, right? But it's really not appropriate for a country of its scale to sort of engage in that sort of misdirection, I would say, or sort of not being completely open. I think they were embarrassed. To be honest, my impression is, this is more in your space than mine, is that they just didn't want to sort of make it clear how vast this plague was, and we still don't know really how big it was in China, um, and that it had spread from China to Europe and to the United States. So I think there was a bit of I think pride gets wrapped up into these things sometimes, and it's
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I think it's about accurate. We try to analyze the intentions and motivations of the Chinese Communist Party all the time, and in this particular case, the most rational explanation does seem to be an element of pride. Do you have any opinions on the origin of the virus itself, whether it came from a lab accidentally released, or whether it was transferred from bats to humans? Is it naturally, or do we have any indications of that yet?
I think there were some pretty good studies, both out of federal laboratories as well as universities, that have looked at the sequence, the genetic sequence of the COVID-19. It's pretty clearly, it's easy to see that it probably came out of a natural environment. Now, whether that natural environment, whether it had been uh, spread in that market like was originally thought, or whether it came from a different source, it it almost doesn't matter. It seems to me that it was probably, there's no indications that it was genetically modified by people. It's clearly a natural
Hmm.
strain. And so the fact that it's a natural strain means, and people still argue about, did it come from bats, or did it go through bats through pangolins, and all that sort of thing. And I think we'll probably know more about that, and after the science gets done. But it looks like it's just a natural virus that spread into the population. And we see how contagious it is, right? I mean, it's easy to imagine, once it gets into a person, right, and it makes that jump from animal to human, it just spreads like wildfire. And at that point, there was, if you look at the measures that China used to sort of suppress the spread of the virus, they are really much stronger than any Western country would ever think about implementing, essentially.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's videos and testimonies of people being welded shut into their apartments, which is
Yeah, I don't think that would go over well in Houston.
no. I mean, we argue about lockdowns at
Yeah.
all, and rightfully so. Again, I know you know where I stand on this. I think there's a sense of humility we have to have about what we can accomplish at a large scale, right? I think it's because I've looked at how some of these Asian countries have dealt with it, in Taiwan and South Korea, I think we wrongly believe that they controlled the population to a much greater extent than they actually did. As it turns out, there's their long time historical exposure to a lot of these diseases appears to have prevented a spread in and of itself. I think various studies have shown that, and so I just think there's a lot we just don't know about how it spreads, and about what we can actually do, and weigh the proper costs and benefits of how to deal with a pandemic. Which is kind of why I asked the original question. It's like, what it is not actually clear to me what lessons we should be deriving, and we should continue to have that conversation. One thing I did want to ask you is, there's a lot of people who are very skeptical of a vaccine. The support for a vaccine, people saying they would actually take it, has dropped significantly. This has become deeply politicized, and I don't need to get into it. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. And I find that to be problematic. So what would you say to people who are concerned about the vaccine, and concerned about the process of the FDA and how it's been accelerated?
Yeah, I think people should be. This is, again, the fact that these things get politicized is really frustrating to me as a scientist, and it sounds like it's frustrating to you as well as a legislator. Um, there's the FDA, the companies that are making these vaccines. Um, are pretty amazing companies. They're run by very responsible scientists and business folks. And I think, they've produced lots of biopharmaceuticals over the decades that have been, instrumental in curing cancers and making vaccines. And the idea that somehow, whether you believe it gets politicized or not, that they're going to change their business model, right, to somehow meet a timeline is just, it doesn't make sense to me. I know a lot of people who work a lot of my friends are in the pharmaceutical industry who went to college with and things like that. And that's just not how it works. I mean, they're about quality control and testing. It's very rigorous. The sort of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials that they go through, they have to go through to show that the vaccine works and that it's safe. That hasn't changed. That doesn't change whether you have a Republican or a Democrat or whoever in terms of the executive branch. And so I think people should have confidence in the vaccine, confidence in the FDA to work with our industry to deliver a vaccine, which I think will be effective. But if people don't use the vaccine, then we'll be stuck in this world where we're wearing masks all the time. I think if we get a good vaccine, I think by the fall of next year, we will be in a situation where life will be back to some basically normal as far as I can tell. We'll have antibodies, we'll have made ourselves, able to hold off the virus. So I think that it's really important that we send a consistent message to folks saying that the science is good here. The regulatory processes are very tight, and they don't change with the government. They don't change because you might want it as a congressman or somebody else. It doesn't work that way. And so I think people should be confident that these vaccines are going to be these are going to be good vaccines. Now, they'll get better with time. Like I said, all over the world, there's over 30 vaccines in development right now. And 5 years from now, we'll know the one we think is the best. But this year, I think the U.S. has several that are really promising, look great so far. And I think Tony Fauci is very clear that until you until you get across the finish line, you don't know. But I think the people, the public should be really confident that those folks are doing a really good job and trying really hard to produce something that'll be effective against COVID-19. And I think if you don't think that's a good idea, you have to get used to wearing masks all the time and being 6 feet apart from people. That doesn't seem like a world I want to be living in all the time.
No. Well, this gets to another conversation. I mean, around Houston, the reality is people aren't living like that, depending on where you're at and where you're hanging out. But for the most part, it's mixed, right? And people are congregating again. They have been for a while, weeks, if not months after our initial spike. So I think it just remains to be seen. I just think there's a lot we don't know, and I'll be interested to see. Are we going to spike again? Are we not? I mean, if we were going to spike again, you would think it would have happened by now, because I've seen people behaving in this manner for weeks now, perhaps even months, and so this virus continues to surprise us. I think. I don't know if you have opinions on that.
Absolutely. There's a lot. We've learned a lot already. To be clear, we've learned a great deal about this virus, a record time, basically. I mean, the world's whole scientific community has been focused on this virus almost to the exclusion of everything else for months now. But there's still some mysteries here, and there's things we don't understand about it. So flu spreads in a very when the COVID-19 first started rolling out from Asia into Europe, and we started using models that were basically based around the flu. Which makes sense because that's our usual model that we have the most data on. And but COVID-19 had some tricks up its sleeve, right? It spread differently. It had these super spreader events, right? That's not something that happens much with flu. Flu is kind of a democratic. It spreads and contaminates people kind of equally. So if you and I are standing in a room with a person who's got flu, probably might give it to two of us. One person gives it to two, then two people give it to four, then four people give it to eight. It grows up in a kind of a predictable way. Whereas COVID-19 had this really weird dynamic of having these super spreader events where essentially one person contaminates 20 people. There's these famous cases now where, you can sort of see in South Korea where one guy goes club hopping during the night and essentially contaminates every single person at those clubs, basically, right? So it spreads differently. And we understand that super spreaders are a much bigger concern. So you don't want to have big congregations of people, right? That's why I think, standing around a barbecue is not as dangerous, outdoors as being cooped up in a room with, 20 people, right?
Right.
And so we know that now. And there's things about the way, if you look at these waves that we're experiencing, they sort of travel around the country. They ripple around the country. Now they're rippling in back to the Midwest, and Europe is seeing a rise again.
Yeah.
And it's really weird the way that's happening. I think there's things we don't kind of know about how this thing is spreading and how our immune systems are responding to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's I think some of the evidence and studies are pretty compelling that show that at about 20% infection rate, it's not necessarily herd immunity. That would be perhaps the wrong word to use, but burnout. And this burnout meaning that just mathematically, it's difficult to see additional spikes in a given region at about that 20% infection rate. And then the question becomes, well, have we reached that in Houston? And again, I ask the question because I see very normal lives being lived in our city, and but I don't see this uptick in cases again. Where is that? That's exactly what you would think would keep happening if people let their guard down. And so, in New York City being the exact same thing, it almost seems like the curve and the trends tend to look very similar. No matter what our actions are, and I don't know. It just seems like we're still learning.
Well, I think it's a combination of things, right? So I think part of it is, when the virus sweeps through an area, of course, some people become immune to it, and that's, moving towards. But classic herd immunity is not reached, until you get over 60% of people have had it. We don't have that indication right now, but we still have people doing things like being a little bit more cautious, right? They're not, like I said, we're not having big events right now. People are still, and although not everybody is wearing masks, at least here in Houston, a lot of people are wearing masks, and they sort
Yeah.
of still be social. So I think it's a combination. Like all those things matter, right?
Yeah.
It's not one. All those things actually matter and make it harder for the virus to spread. So, I think we might be seeing kind of a combination of things that we're doing that are being relatively effective. And so, yeah, I hope we don't have another wave in Houston. I think I don't know. I don't think anybody could tell you. At least I wouldn't believe anybody had told you they knew exactly what was going to happen over the next three to 6 months. But yeah, it does seem to follow this pattern. It waves, then it sort of burns out for a while, and then the question is, we'll see in Europe. I think is going to be the real indicator whether they have a significantly large sort of second wave, right? I hope not, but I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, and I wonder what would cause that. I wonder again. It seems like we still haven't answered the basic question of if you've had it, you're immune to it from now on. Because I mean, there's been some known cases where somebody's gotten it twice, but it seems to be pretty rare. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the science is still clearly out on terms of how long the immunity lasts for. So I hope that it lasts for a long time. So when we get this vaccine that we're that hopefully be coming this spring, for in terms of mass deployment, I hope that it's a once a year kind of dose. But you could imagine that you might only give you immunity for 3 months or 6 months. But what I would argue is if we can deliver a vaccine to most of the world, let's say at least to in doses large enough to say get half the population, and they all get, say, even if they only got 6 months of immunity, well, that virus is essentially extinguished, right? It won't have spread. There's no animal reservoir in the United States or in Europe, presumably, for this virus. And so
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, you sort of extinguish it. Now, can it rise again out of it? China again? It could, but I suspect the Chinese will be vaccinating like heck and also being very vigilant for it because they don't want to have this again. So they'll be
Mm-hmm.
motivated to keep it under control. So my feeling is we're going to be in a good position a year from now. But we just have to, we're just sort of playing for time until the vaccines get here. That's really what our strategy is. We're just trying to
Yeah.
get through this until we get a vaccine, and then I think we can have life as normal again.
I like that optimistic tone to end with, perhaps. And no, and I think it is important to give people the expert truth on the vaccines and the safety of those vaccines, because there's a lot of doubt being sown out there. So, Yousif, we really appreciate that, and appreciate all the other really cool stuff you guys are working on at Rice. It really is fascinating. If only they'd let me in, right, as a student. I could talk more about it. Were you on the admissions board back then?
No, I'm not that old. Come on, man. But I can tell you, I often tell my students, I'm not sure I could have gotten into Rice University. I went to Carnegie Mellon, right? So it's a good school. I'm not sure I could have gotten into Rice.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I'm not bitter about it. I just joke about it sometimes on the podcast, especially when I have guests from Rice. So always appreciate it. Hometown university, one of the best in the country, and working on some really interesting research. Thanks to guys like you, Yousif Shamoo. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right. It's a lot of fun.